Good day, everybody. My name is Ritzman R. Estor, and today I will be talking about instructional objectives, its characteristics or the characteristics of a well written objective, characteristics of a useful objective, and lastly, the kinds of instructional objectives. Before I proceed with the discussion, I'd just like to share some thought with you. Most people would agree that or the goal of education is learning. Most would also agree that education is likely to be more effective if educators are clear about what it is that they want the learners to learn. Finally, most would agree that if the teachers have a clear idea about what learners are expected to learn, they can more easily and more accurately determine how well students have learned. Instructional objectives. Because instructional objectives specify exactly what is supposed to be learned. They are helpful to the teacher as well as the learner throughout the learning process and are invaluable in the evaluation process. Instructional objectives, also known as behavioral objectives or learning objectives, are basically statements which clearly describe an anticipated learning outcome. When objectives were first coming into their own in education, they almost always began with the phrase, upon completion of this lesson, the students should be able to dot dot dot. This phrase focused on the outcome of learning rather than on the learning process. In fact, one of the criteria of a well-written objective is that it describes the outcome of learning. That is what the learners can do after learning has occurred that they might not have been able to do before the teaching and learning process began. The characteristics of a well-written objective. A well-written objective should meet the following criteria. First is it must describe a learning outcome. Second is it must be student oriented. And third is it must be observable or describe an observable product. A well-written objective should describe a learning outcome. For example, to correctly spell the spelling words on page 17. It should not describe a learning activity just like this. To practice the words on page 17 by writing each one 10 times. Learning activities are important in planning and guiding instruction, but they are not to be confused with instructional objectives. We just need to keep in mind that activities are different from objectives. Second characteristic is that it must be student oriented. A student oriented objective focuses on the learner, not on us, the teachers. It describes what the learners will be able what the learners will be expected to be able to do. It should not describe a teacher activity. For example, to go over the words on page 17 with the students, explaining their meaning and telling them how the words are pronounced. It may be helpful to both the teacher and the student to know what the teacher is going to do, but teacher activities are also not to be confused with instructional objectives. Lastly is it must be observable or describe an observable product. If an instructional objective is not observable or does not describe an observable product, it leads to unclear expectations, and it will be difficult to determine whether or not it had been reached. The key to writing observable objectives is to use verbs that are observable and lead to a well-defined product of the action implied by that verb. Verbs such as to know, to understand, to enjoy, to appreciate, to realize, and to value are vague and not observable. Instead, we should use the verbs such as to identify, to list, to select, to compute, to predict, and to analyze. Those verbs are explicit and describe observable actions or actions that lead to observable products. There are many skills that cannot be directly observed, just like the thinking process of a student as the student tries to solve a math problem. Problem, it cannot be observed easily. However, one can look or a student can look at the answers she comes up with and determine if they are correct. It is also possible to look at the steps a student takes to arrive at an answer if they are written down. An example of this is solving the math problem. We cannot check the thinking process of the students while the student is answering the or solving the math problem, but if the student comes up with a solution or a computation, we can check it and assess it. There are many end products that can also be observed. Just For us English teachers, we can provide, or we can ask the students to provide us a prose paragraph, a poem, a short story, or an outline of a story. Those are examples of an end product. Next are the characteristics of a useful objective. To be useful for instruction, an objective must not only be well written, but it also must meet the following criteria. First is to be sequentially appropriate. Second is be attainable within a reasonable amount of time. And third is be developmentally appropriate. For an objective to be sequentially appropriate, it must occur in a in an appropriate place in the instructional sequence. All prerequisite objective must already have been attained. Nothing thwarts the learning process more than having learners trying to accomplish an objective before they have learned the necessary prerequisites. This is why continuous assessments of student progress is so important. Next is that it must be attainable within a reasonable amount of time. A useful objective is attainable within a reasonable time. If an instructional objective takes students an inordinately long time to accomplish, it is either sequentially inappropriate or it is too broad, relying on the accomplishment of several outcomes or skills rather than a single outcome or skill. An objective should set expectation for a single learning outcome and not a cluster of them. Lastly is it must be developmentally appropriate. Developmentally appropriate objectives set expectations for students that are well within their level of intellectual, social, language, and moral development. Teachers, parents, and others who are working with preschool or elementary school children should be especially aware of the development stages of the children they are working with. No author or researcher has more clearly defined the stages of intellectual development than Jean Piaget. Familiarity with his work as well as the work of other child development specialists like Lev Vygotsky's language development, Lawrence Kohlberg's moral development, and Eric Erickson's social development. With the help of these development specialists, we can produce better instructional objectives. They are very helpful. Next is the kinds of instructional objectives. Instructional objectives are often classified according to the kind or level of learning that is required in order to reach them. There are numerous taxonomies of instructional objectives. The most common taxonomy was developed by Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues. The first level of taxonomy divides objectives into three categories: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Simply put, cognitive objectives focus on the mind, affective objectives focus on emotions or affect, and lastly, psychomotor objectives focus on the body. Cognitive objectives call for outcomes of mental activity such as memorizing, reading, problem solving, analyzing, and synthesizing, and drawing conclusions. Bloom and others further categorize cognitive objectives into various levels, from the simplest cognitive tasks to the most complex cognitive tasks. These categories can be helpful when trying to order objectives so they are sequentially appropriate. This helps to ensure that prerequisite outcomes are accomplished first. Next is the affective. Affective objectives focus on emotions. Whenever a person seeks to learn to react in an appropriate way or inappropriate way in an appropriate way emotionally, there is some thinking going on. What distinguishes affective objectives from cognitive objectives is the fact that the goal of affective objectives is some kind of affective behavior of the product of an affect. An example of this is the attitude or an attitude. The goal of cognitive objectives, on the other hand, is some kind of cognitive response or the products of cognitive response, just like the problem solved. Psychomotor objectives focus on the body, and the goal of these objectives is the control or manipulation of the muscular skeletal system or some part of it. An example of this are writing, dancing, tumbling, passing a ball, or drawing. All skills requiring fine or gross motor coordination fall into the psychomotor category. To learn a motor skill requires some cognition. However, the ultimate goal is not the cognitive aspect of the skill, such as memorizing the steps to take. The ultimate goal is the control of muscles or muscle groups. The role of objectives in teaching and testing. Objectives can be helpful in instructional planning, during the teaching or learning process, and when assessing students' progress. Instructional objectives are often ignored by both teachers and students, or are at best occasionally referred to. However, it can be argued that instructional objectives should guide the teaching and learning process from beginning to end. Most lesson plan forms include a place for the objectives of the lesson to be recorded. However, to write an objective down and to plan the lesson around the topic of the lesson rather than around the learning outcomes to be reached is missing the point. There is good evidence in the human learning literature that different kinds of outcomes are learned differently. Robert Gagne was one of the first researchers to articulate this. It follows from his research that instructional planning must take into account the kind of learning the students will be engaged in as they seek to reach an objective. Effective teachers learn to categorize their instructional objective and then develop the teaching and learning activities that will help students to do that will help students do the kind of thinking required for that kind of learning. It's time to evaluate. I'll just want to give you guys some tips. These are just tips. How does an educator know what to measure? We just need to look at the objectives. How does a teacher know what kind of information gathering tools to use, like test, rubric, portfolio? Just study the objectives. Any test item, any rating scale or checklist, any technique devised to collect information about student progress must seek to measure the instructional objectives as directly and as simply as possible. Instructional objectives are extremely valuable teaching tools that guide both the teachers and students throughout the learning and teaching process. And my hashtag for my report is objectivable. And these are my references. Thank you guys for listening.